Everyone makes poor decisions, like putting milk in tea first instead of hot water, or even heating the tea by putting it in the microwave. In the UK, that's treason. Most of us don't make poor decisions that could potentially cause everyone else to experience hardship. Instead, we elect people to do that for us. But for the medieval kings of England, their poor decisions could wreak havoc on the lives of the people of England. In this video, we will go over every medieval king of England's worst decision, starting from when they're king, from Alpha Alfred to Havoc Henry VIII. A quick spoiler, the Anglo-Saxon kings of England are going to be quite difficult to pick their worst decision because of the lack of sources, as well as that some simply ruled for such a short time. Normally, I try to spend quite a bit of time on each of them, but on this occasion, some will be quite short. Alfred the Great, the agreements with the Norsemen, most notably the Viking Guthrum. Before Alfred's major victory at the Battle of Edington in 878, in 876, Alfred had made a tentative agreement with the Viking raiding armies, which included hostages and oaths on holy relics on Alfred's side. Not long afterwards, according to Asser, the Viking army broke the treaty and moved to Exeter. Alfred's forces pursued them and besieged them there. Again, peace was made via a treaty, and the Viking army moved either to Gloucester or stayed at Exeter. The sources aren't clear on which, or fail to mention the exact location. Regardless, the Vikings soon surprised Alfred with a mid-winter attack. Alfred was caught off guard and had to flee from Chippenham to the swamps of Somerset, where the Viking army would struggle to follow. From there, Alfred built his forces back up before confronting the Vikings at Edington. Alfred had nearly lost it all by lowering his guard, although to move an army in winter was a bold move. Edward the Elder. Almost all the actions of the early years of his reign indicated a determination to be well prepared for any future invasions of his kingdom. This must have been the motive behind the land exchanges of which we have witnessed in his early charters. While these invasions did come and were mostly defeated by 920, Edward was now in a dominant position, building burhs all over his new territories. But for all of Edward's kingdom building, it's how the kingdom might survive after his death. Edward's reign suffers from what I like to call hungry hippo syndrome, where Edward had a lot of sons, 6 in total, although not all of them made it to adulthood. The succession in this time period is messy, as Edward was king of the Anglo-Saxons, which was a fairly new title. While the Saxon kingdoms of Wessex and Mercia had been intermingling for years now, they still had their own separate nobles and their own witan. If we just read the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, they simply mention that Æthelstan succeeded to the kingdom with no issues. Historians disagree with this easy succession, as his younger brother may have been chosen by the Wessex witan to be king of Wessex and Æthelstan to be king of Mercia. Luckily for Æthelstan, his brother died 16 days after Edward at Oxford. We can speculate how Æthelstan's brother died, but rather his death avoided a potential civil war. In summary, Edward's worst decision was not naming a successor, or if he did, we don't have the evidence, as the last years of Edward's reign are scarce for information. Æthelstan. If we read the accounts of William of Malmesbury, it seems that Æthelstan made no terrible decisions, nor in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles is there one bit of criticism for Æthelstan. He's this glorious medieval warrior king, yet Æthelstan utterly failed in one aspect of medieval kingship which I rank as important: marriage and producing heirs. Æthelstan never married nor produced an heir. There is speculation that he chose a celibate life for religious reasons or for political reasons. as Æthelstan had plenty of brothers and sisters who would have their own children, which is rather lucky for Æthelstan, as we will get to a king who didn't have the luxury of having plenty of siblings to pass the crown on. Edmund, our first brief Anglo-Saxon king. Edmund's worst decision was going 1v1 with the thief who was threatening his Stuart, as Edmund lost his life trying to rescue him, according to the John of Worcester's account. Edred. It's quite a struggle to get much information for Edward's reign that isn't based around a military campaign or his sickly way of trying to eat, but at the same time with Æthelstan, Edred didn't marry or produce any heirs. Eadwig, ridding your court of wise advisors. The most notable advisor that Eadwig banished was Dunstan, the Archbishop of Glastonbury. Dunstan was a close friend and ally to the previous king, but it seemed Eadwig sought counsel elsewhere, and his new advisors sought to enrich their allies by advising the king to grant a large amount of land away in Eadwig's first year as king in 956. This poor attempt to bolster support soon backfired, as the disgruntled nobles who were replaced soon rallied behind Eadwig's younger brother, Edgar. Thankfully for the Kingdom of England, civil war was avoided, but the kingdom was split in two, but not for long, as Eadwig would be dead by 959. Edgar. Centralization of England under a strong hand. That's how I would describe Edgar's reign from 959 to 975. The major monastic reforms of Edgar's reign saw a lot of monasteries refounded, which also meant a lot of land was transferred to these religious houses. The deals that some laymen received were less than desirable, but given how powerful Edgar was, hardly anything was done for any complaints, until Edgar's unexpected death in 975. The life of St. Oswald explains what happened after Edgar's death. This great king died on the 8th of July 975. At his death, the commonwealth of the entire realm was shaken. Bishops were perplexed, aldermen were angry, monks were struck with fear, the people were terrified, and the secular clerics were made happy because their time had come. Abbots are now expelled, together with their monks. Clerics are brought in together with their wives. Edgar's overzealous attitude towards the monastic reforms alienated a lot of disgruntled groups, and with Edgar's death, they were unleashed. Edward the Martyr. Paying a visit to his half-brother Ethelred and Ethelred's mother's house was Edward's worst decision, as it would not lead to some wholesome family reunion, but rather Edward getting murdered, according to one account. Ethelred. For me, it's that he never led his own forces when it mattered, instead only leading his forces a few times. After the Viking victory at the Battle of Maldon in 991, which only involved local forces in England against a Viking raiding army, not a national force which Ethelred could summon, Ethelred's government started to pay off the Vikings. The problem is that Ethelred never led these major forces. He always gave command to an alderman. While that would be fine for a campaign along the borders, when there's a national crisis, a medieval king should lead. His predecessors all did. Sven Forkbeard. Clearly his worst decision was conquering the Kingdom of England, as he would be dead not long afterwards. Either the weather or the food, or even dealing with the people within England, was too much for poor old Sven. Edmund Ironsides. It's quite hard to pick anything for Edmund, as he spent his reign fighting Canute before coming to an agreement with him. Edmund would then die a few months later. Canute. While Canute tried to govern England well after all the raiding, death and destruction caused by his invasion, Canute's new realm needed stability and was to be governed according to the laws of King Edgar. But the problem is that with the death of most of the Anglo-Saxon nobility and the bloody purges during Canute's reign meant that certain earls became incredibly powerful. A medieval king with a few powerful earls doesn't bode well. You need plenty of nobles with smaller landholdings rather than a few with large amounts. This issue is perfectly demonstrated during the reign of Edward the Confessor and his difficulties with the Godwins. Harold's reign is messy. If Harthacnut had been in England and not Denmark securing that throne, Harold would not have become king. There was significant opposition to Harold, yet to his credit, he subdued these rival groups. But his half-brother, Harthacnut, was planning an attempt to take back the English throne. The problem is Harold died after a short reign, so it's quite difficult to pick anything of note. Let's go with something from the eulogy of Queen Emma. For when others entered church to hear mass, as is the Christian custom, he either surrounded the glades with dogs for the chase. Harthacnut, his worst decision was attacking the city of Worcester. Beginning their works of destruction through the city and province continued it for 4 days, but very few of the citizens or provincials were taken or slain, because, having noticed of their coming, the people fled in all directions. A great number of the citizens took refuge in a small island called Beveridge, situated in the middle of the River Severn, and having fortified it, defended themselves so stoutly against their enemies that they obtained terms of peace, and were allowed free liberty to return home. On the 5th day, the city having been burnt, everyone marched off loaded with plunder, and the king's wrath was satisfied. What a tosser. Edward the Confessor. It's got to be the succession. It's messy. Many different sources state different things. The life of St. Edward states that as Edward was dying and stretching forth his hand to his governor, her brother Harold, he said, "I commend this woman and all the kingdom to your protection." The life of St. Edward was sponsored by Edith, Edward's wife and Harold's sister. Various other sources say differently. John of Worcester states that Edward chose Harold as he was elected by the leading men of England, the Witan. William of Malmesbury, however, mentions that Edward gave his succession in England to William. Then there's the pro-Norman sources, like William of Poitiers, who I'm sure you can guess who he supported. Edgar Atheling, the grandson of Edmund Ironsides, was a teenager with no political backing, or with anyone powerful enough to have challenged the Godwins. But also, the Witan chose Harold. They wouldn't choose a foreign duke over a man who had proved he was an effective leader. But it's all up to interpretation. Harold Godwinson. In the last episode, I talked about the Battle of Stamford Bridge as Harold's greatest achievement. Now for Harold's worst decision, the Battle of Hastings, or more specifically, about troop numbers more than anything else, as we're not going to fall into a trap of historical determinization. While we know the outcome of Hastings, Harold had every reason to believe he would beat William. His troops were battle-hardened, and Harold was an experienced military commander. He might have also thought that God was on his side after the victory at Stamford Bridge. Plus, he chose an excellent position to defend. The problem is, for such a world history-defining battle, there's so many accounts of the battle, which is great for us as opposed to earlier battles. For example, Æthelstan's great victory at Brunanburh. Some sources mention that Harold could have waited for more troops before marching to face William. If that's true, then that would be Harold's worst decision. But, emboldened by success, it's understandable why Harold rushed off to face William. William I. The harrying of the north is William's worst decision. The quote about the harrying was from Orderic Vitalis' account, in which he condemns William for such a horrid act towards his subjects. It's not good kingship to indiscriminately slaughter the people under your charge. Many different accounts describe the atrocity. William spent the whole winter in laying waste the country, slaughtering the inhabitants, and inflicting every sort of evil without cessation. William II. You might think going on that hunting trip was William's worst decision, as it resulted in his death, and it's a fine choice. However, it seems from my perspective that the notion that William's death, accidental or not, was a rare thing. It wasn't. Hunting was a sport a lot of medieval kings enjoyed, but it was incredibly dangerous. I'm surprised more kings haven't died during a hunting trip. William's elder brother, Richard, also died in the New Forest during a hunt. There's quite a few occasions where a king has nearly died during a hunt, but William II is the only medieval English king to die during a hunt. Now, if you were to read certain accounts by different clergymen, their text tells us that William's worst decision was everything during his reign. Henry of Huntingdon, born in 1088, really seemed to despise William. His account of William's reign is incredibly hostile. King William's cruel life was brought to an end by an unhappy death. Other accounts are far more kind to William, but his death is more famous than his life, so going hunting that day, unfortunately, was his worst decision. Henry I. The king, therefore, having lost his son William, and there being as yet no other direct heir to the kingdom, for that reason made over the right to the crown to his daughter. Unfortunately, this is Henry's worst decision, picking his daughter to be his successor. While it worked out all well in the end, with the ascension of Henry's grandson, Henry II, to the throne of England, getting there took a civil war known as the Anarchy. Because Empress Matilda was a woman, and in this point in time, when a noble woman married a man, her assets became his. It's how Henry II obtained the Duchy of Aquitaine when he married Eleanor of Aquitaine. I do wonder why Henry didn't get his bastard son Robert, Earl of Gloucester, legitimised and made heir. He would have made a good king. After all, Henry's father, William the Conqueror, was a bastard himself. But according to the deeds of King Stephen, Robert was advised not to press his claim over his nephew, Henry. King Stephen, his action of taking the throne, was Stephen's wildcard option, as a few years afterwards, the civil war known as the Anarchy would dominate the rest of his reign. Henry II, another king suffering from hungry hippo syndrome. Henry had 5 sons, 4 of which survived into adulthood, and trying to appease them all was Henry's longest standing issue. His boys were very much like himself, inheriting many of Henry's traits, such as a tremendous temper, the angry Angevins. This quote from one of our sources sums up the later part of Henry's reign. The later years of the reign are considered during which it was the activities of the king's sons, rather than Henry's own initiative, which largely determined the course of events. The Great Revolt, where 3 of Henry's eldest sons and his wife rebelled against him, is a prime example. For Henry's worst decision, I'm going with not visiting his dying son, Henry the young king. The young king had tried to start another revolt against his father, but it failed miserably. The young king then also caught dysentery, which turned fatal. As he lay dying, he sent word to his father to visit him. King Henry, dubious of any plots, refused to see him, instead sending a bishop. The young king died a few days later, and Henry mournfully stated that, "He has cost me enough, but I wish he had lived to cost me more." The young king's death caused King Henry to radically change his future plans. Richard the Lionheart. I know the Third Crusade is one of Richard's achievements, but Jesus Christ, the illnesses Richard and the French King Philip both suffered with, I'm amazed not one of them died during the crusade. It sounded horrible. Plus, getting captured and ransomed for a huge amount of money while your kingdom and other land holdings are at risk due to a treacherous brother scheming with the French king is not a good look. So Richard's worst decision, but also one of his best achievements, was the Third Crusade. John. Where do I start with King John? Killing his nephew blackened his reputation even further, taking another man's betrothed and then threatening the man's family, causing them to ally with your main rival, the King of France, or causing a civil war with his barons, forcing them into an untenable position where they felt they had no choice but to support another for the throne of England. There's so many decisions to choose. I would say, as a Manchester United fan, that King John's worst decision was founding the city of Liverpool. Henry III and royal favouritism. Nothing new here, medieval kings all had favourites, but in Henry's case, he allowed the rise of a man who would one day best him in battle and keep him as little more than a living seal. That man was Simon de Montfort, the Earl of Leicester. Simon was not some Norman baron whose family had lived in England since the Norman Conquest. Rather, Simon was a French nobleman with some family in England. Simon rapidly became one of Henry's favourites, even allowing Simon to marry his sister Eleanor, which caused a scandal amongst the English barons. Simon possessed traits which Henry himself lacked. Simon was brave, a natural leader, and by the Second Barons' War, an experienced commander. After the Battle of Lewes, Simon had captured the king and his heir Edward. What followed was a period of humiliation for Henry, but Edward soon escaped and raised an army to hunt down Simon and his allies, eventually trapping them in the small town of Evesham. The battle that followed was bloody and brutal. Henry himself was dressed in Simon's colours and nearly killed, but was eventually rescued. This became an incredibly embarrassing episode for King Henry. Edward I and the Scottish War of Independence. What started as an act of arbitration to prevent a civil war in Scotland turned into Scotland's fight for independence. King Edward on a few occasions had tried to get the Scottish King Alexander III to submit Scotland under an overlordship, similar to how Henry II had forced William the Lion, King of the Scots, to swear to be his sworn man for the Kingdom of Scotland. But that overlordship ended when Richard the Lionheart needed funds for his crusade. But now, with all of Alexander's family line dead and Scotland divided, Edward planned to conquer Scotland as he had done in Wales. While he was initially successful, the war dragged on and Edward was getting old, plus the strain on his vast resources was starting to mount. This would lead to major issues for Edward's successor, as he died leading a campaign that never reached Scotland. Edward II and royal favourites. Once again a king who prioritised a single favourite over others. Piers Gaveston first, then Hugh Despenser the Younger. Both these men would infuriate the English nobility, and both men would pay with their lives. The action of promoting these men would also add to the many grievances that ultimately toppled Edward from the throne. Edward III. I could argue that Edward's worst decision was starting what would become the 116 Years' War, which England ultimately lost. But Edward could not have predicted the war lasting that long. One of the issues during the war was that Edward's government by 1360 wanted French land without any obligation of homage towards the French king. Many different historians have varying opinions on Edward, ranging from him being selfish and solely fixated on the war goals over his people's needs. The problem is that Edward was such a successful medieval king. He ticked all the right boxes for what a medieval king should be. He married well, he had plenty of children, he defeated his enemies and established his dominance and expanded his realm with great victories that cemented his legacy. There is the Battle of Stanhope Park, where Edward was nearly captured during a raid on the English camp by the Scots. But that was early in Edward's reign, when he was under the control of Roger Mortimer, his mother's ally and lover. There was the Parliament of 1341, where Edward clashed with his nobles and clergy, leading to a humiliating climb down over the crown's financial control. Or the later parliaments in the 1370s, where Edward was simply too ill to rein in his son, John of Gaunt, who was acting tyrannical, especially introducing the poll tax. Richard II and the Duke of Lancaster's inheritance. In this one act of taking his cousin's rightful lands and titles, Richard had inadvertently created the path to his downfall and imprisonment. When his uncle John of Gaunt died on the 3rd of February 1399, Richard had a choice: allow his son Henry Bolingbroke to become the new Duke of Lancaster, creating a powerful rival, or take the lands and title away from him, which would piss off a large amount of the nobility and set a dangerous precedent. He chose the latter, and unsurprisingly, Henry didn't take the news well, and before long he arrived in England with a small following, which got bigger and bigger. Richard was in Ireland when he got the news, and reportedly stated, "Come hither, friends. Good Lord, this man plans to deprive me of my country." And that's exactly what happened. Henry IV and taking the bloody throne. The difficulty of Henry trying to retain the throne is perhaps one reason he ruled only for 14 years. The stress of the uprisings, plus nearly losing his son and heir during the Battle of Shrewsbury, where the later Henry V was hit in the face by a bodkin arrow, the bouts of illnesses leaving him unable to act in his capacity as king, and the rumours of Richard II still being alive, despite his body being displayed. Richard haunted Henry's reign. Henry V, for a king who wanted to fix the issues plaguing England for the last 20 years and bring the nobility of England back together from the trials and tribulations of both Richard II and Henry IV's reign, Henry V succeeded in restoring England to what some commentators saw as a return to the grand age of Edward III. I think the problem I want to say is that, again, similar to Richard the Lionheart, that the Crusades were the worst decision, but also one of the great achievements of Richard's reign. The same argument can apply to Henry V, that Henry became the heir to the French throne. Henry would have to redo what he had done in England of healing divisions. But in France's case, Henry stoked divisions, plus the cost of the war both in men and resources. But we will never know how Henry might have ruled both England and France together, as he died only aged 35, leaving a messy settlement for his kingdom and his successor, Henry VI. Similar to King John, there's so many I could choose, I don't know which one to pick. The treaties with the French, the Wars of the Roses, the settlements, the Act of Accord, there's too many to pick. Edward IV and marrying Elizabeth Woodville at his pleasure. The fact that Edward dragged his feet in telling his council gathered at Reading Abbey that he was now married, as the news of the marriage wouldn't be received well to many of Edward's allies and his own mother, but especially towards Edward's most important ally, the Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker. Regardless if the marriage was of love or lust, Edward was 22 and Elizabeth was 28. She was a widow with 2 young boys. The normal way of marriage for Edward's time was he would wed a foreign princess, not one of his own subjects. While the marriage was successful, producing plenty of children, the diplomatic consequences would nearly cost Edward his throne, as the kingmaker, Warwick, would switch sides back to Henry VI, causing Edward to flee to Burgundy for a time, until he returned and defeated Warwick at the Battle of Barnet and the rest of his enemies at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Edward V and going into the Tower of London. Although it's not like he had a choice in the matter, so it's redundant to talk about. Richard III, putting the princes in the Tower. That went well for Richard's historical reputation, didn't it? Regardless of the fate of the boys, the conspiracies and theories on what happened to the boys is intertwined with Richard's reign, although the Tower of London was the safest place for the boys. I've read many books on Richard III from various decades and the chronicles from the time period, and not surprisingly, no one can agree on the fate of the princes in the Tower. One book in particular is titled Richard III, Medieval Kingship from 1993, described as 7 historians, all acknowledged experts on the 15th century, yet with wildly divergent views of the life and reign of Richard III. Reading this book really emphasized how much of a daunting task it would be to conclusively prove what happened to the princes in the Tower. Henry VII and his treatment of Catherine of Aragon. Yes, both Henry VII and Henry VIII treated Catherine horribly. What started off as a warm welcome to England upon Catherine's arrival to marry Henry's eldest son, Arthur, turned into a nightmare for her. Arthur died shortly after their wedding, and Catherine was left in limbo for years. The back and forth letters to her reluctant father rarely helped her woes. Henry, in the last few years of his reign, had a cold manner towards her, dragging the issue of her dowry and creating a situation where Catherine was in near constant financial trouble for a man so obsessed with his dynasty's survival. Not allowing Catherine and Henry to marry and start producing future heirs is just plain odd. As if disease took Arthur, it could have taken Prince Henry, or rather Henry might have wanted another match to secure an alliance with another power. If that's the case, then allowing Catherine to return home would have been a kindness. In the end, Henry did little to help Catherine, and his death finally set her free to marry the now King Henry VIII. That poor girl. Henry VIII. While there's many choices I could pick for Henry's reign, the dissolution of the monasteries is the decision that really vexes me. The way in which they were torn down and the building materials sold off. While some were saved, for example Tewkesbury Abbey, the majority weren't so lucky, and so much heritage was lost to us. If you go to any medieval religious site in Britain, Henry's taint is somewhere upon it. Henry's actions changed the landscape of not just England, but also Ireland and Wales.